Well, as I've been reporting tonight throughout the show, the Victorian corruption body IBAC has accused senior Andrews government figures of misconduct and improper influence. Joining me now to discuss this is the Victorian editor for the Australian newspaper, Damon Johnston. Damon, thank you so much for your time. Look, these were
Good to be here, Sharri.
These are quite serious, very serious findings by the corruption watchdog. I mean, damning findings, but Daniel Andrews just seemed to shrug them off today.
It was Dan at his audacious best. He dismissed this 130-page document as an educational report, essentially. But when you even just turn to page 2, and I'll just quote a little bit from page 2 because it's quite important, it talks in terms of evidence of misconduct, improper influence, interference, obstruction, breaches of duties and obligations by both ministers, staff and public servants. Now, this is regarding a $1.2 million contract, so it's a lot of money. Just so happened that contract went to a Labor-affiliated union around the 2018 election that the Labor government, the Andrews government, was very keen to keep on side.
I mean, the findings, you read them there. I read a lot of the findings at the start of the show as well. Clear conflict of interest. It wasn't disclosed that this contract was being awarded to a Labor-affiliated union. There was no competitive tender process. The Commissioner said that this didn't fit corruption under the Act, but he did, very clearly point out that this was misconduct. Daniel Andrews then had a press conference today where he said, no, there were no findings against anyone personally. Is this problematic? Is this just his spin, or do you think the corruption body should have named names?
Well, they named the Premier, they named the 2 health ministers. They chose not to name the bureaucrats and the ministerial staff. They haven't really explained why. But look, just in terms of the language IBAC used, it was very strong, Sharri. Again, page 2. IBAC's Operation Daintree found evidence of misconduct and improper influence. It also was quite scathing in its assessment of sort of ministerial control from both the Premier and the 2 health ministers. Essentially, the Premier and both health ministers told IBAC in these private hearings, and that's really significant to remember, these were not public hearings, they were private hearings. They told IBAC that they were essentially unaware of what their advisors were doing. Now, IBAC has called that out and said even if they were unaware, they should have been aware. The Premier is accountable. So while the Premier is correct in a very technical sense that there was no findings of corrupt activity against any one individual, including the politicians and himself.
Yes.
It was, the narrative was scathing, damning.
But Damon, clearly there wasn't any email or hard evidence that the body found where the ministers were directing the staff and the public servants to give this contract to the HWU without any tender process. But is it really believable that the staff and the public servants just came up with this idea themselves?
Well, let me refer to Jenny Mikakos, the former health minister, to answer your question, Sharri. She, in her evidence to IBAC, referred to Dan Andrews' tentacles everywhere. And what she was referring to then was the command and control culture that the Andrews government operates under. What she's saying is that the Premier's private office runs the show to an extreme nature. Now, most modern governments run a form of command and control out of either the Prime Minister's office or the Premier's office. In one sense, that's not unusual. But what Daniel Andrews has done, he's weaponised that, according to Labor people I speak to, and it is so tight and so controlled. So on one hand,
yes,
for that to be widely acknowledged as the culture, but on the other hand, for the Premier to say he wasn't aware of what his one of his key union advisors was saying, I think it's hard to reconcile those two statements.
No, it stretches belief. Damon, I have to ask you quickly, look, this story, when this first broke, there was actually an injunction taken out by the corruption body to stop this from being reported. I think this is something that the public now deserve to know about.
Yeah, so like most IBAC inquiries, this has taken years. This has been going on since 2019. Now, they could blame a little bit of that delay around COVID perhaps, but these things go on for too long. Now, The Age, Paul Sakala at The Age broke this story originally just before the state election. Mysteriously, IBAC found out he was going to report about this, and they sought and won an injunction against Paul's newspaper. Various details then leaked out over the coming days, but this was a very tightly kept secret. And it goes to the point. This should have been a public hearing, Sharri.
Yes.
The Premier should have been cross-examined in public.
Well, definitely. We're out of time, Damon, but completely agree. Thank you so much for joining me.